to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Bundjalung people, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We are The Pin, Lucille and I, a website dedicated to talking about race, identity and culture in the Australian context, and we're partnered with APRA today to talk about the power of enough and what that means to the fellow artists and music industry people that we have here on this stage.
Hi, I'm Lucie, and this is Theo. I thought I'd just introduce some of our panellists today. So I'll start with DJ Jennifer Loveless. From Melbourne by way of Toronto, Canada, DJ Jennifer Loveless is one of Australia's most hardworking DJs and is quickly developing a name for herself as one of the best selectors. Her sets move into techno and beyond, and you'll be performing on the Tiny Dancer stage later today at 6:30.
Next to her is Neil Morris, aka DRMNGNOW, youre MC, instrumentalist, poet, radio presenter, keeper of song and cultural performer. His music fuses experimental beats with decolonising poetry, delivering a narrative of the lived experience of his indigeneity. He also put together one of the best panels I think that we've seen on this stage before, the treaty panel, and it's a real honour to have him here on this stage, backing it up yet again to spread his wisdom.
And then we have Fuamoli. She is a music writer, content producer and radio host with a list of interviewees and publications that I think reads like a bucket list. She's profiled some of the world's biggest artists and music festivals and is on the judging panel for the Australian Music Prize. She's written for the likes of Rolling Stone Australia, the AU Review, The Big Issue and Music Feeds. And you will be in the forum, so back here, doing a talk on Is It Environmentally Responsible to Be Human, which will be tomorrow at 12:30.
And last but not least, Thandi Phoenix has garnered attention for her unique blend of pop and electronica meets garage, drum and bass. An artist on the rise, she's just completed her first national tour, taken part in Triple J's Like a Version and supported the likes of Tiny Temper, Vera Blue, Miguel, The Rudimentals and more. But most importantly, she has also touched Beyonce's hair. Yeah.
Don't touch my hair.
And she'll be performing at the Mix Up stage tomorrow at 12:15.
Yeah, cool. So before we kick it off, I will mention that if we get a chance for questions at the end, there'll be a box thing that you just literally throw around and you speak into the box for questions. That's the best way that I can describe it. You'll understand it when you see it. So I'll kick it off. This is a question for all of you. So where did it all start for you? And I'm not talking just career-wise, but when you started to get into what you are now, where did it all start?
Okay, I guess we can just... for me, I guess I was raised quite musical. My dad had like this dream of me and my brothers being like the next Jackson 5 or whatever, which obviously didn't happen. But kind of it was in my life for a lot, and I've always loved dancing as well, and my relationship with music has always been quite physical. So I guess kind of when I started uni, I started going, well, yeah, I was always dancing like throughout like my primary years, and then when I was old enough to like I guess go to parties and things like that, that's when I discovered the DJ and like kind of understood that it wasn't just a room full of cooked people, that like actually there's a lot of understanding and a lot like that you can learn about yourself and self-confidence and how to like move through this world through dance and through learning to interact with people, because like I guess like the things that you learn on a dance floor can be applied to like your life in general. So yeah, that's kind of, is that the question? Yeah.
So would you like to tell us you're in?
It's kind of funny. It's kind of started similarly for me. I grew up surrounded by musicians and dancers as well. So my formative years were spent up in the Northern Territory. And I kind of became connected to my community and I guess the wider Polynesian community through dancing. So we were I was with a company for about 10 years before I moved back to Adelaide for university. So a lot of those crucial years was always surrounded by live musicians and live music. And I think that really kind of informed my desire to turn that into a career, because I am tone deaf and I can't play anything to save my life, which, coming from a Samoan background, I feel like it's skipped a gene, because we are a very creative and musical people. Anyway, so I started writing about music during my second year on a uni student's budget, which was $0. So reviewing got me access to shows, and then I started profiling people and digging a little bit deeper, talking about how music kind of informs personal growth and change. And that brings me here pretty much, so constantly weaving in and out, for sure.
Thandi.
Hello. So yeah, my journey I grew up in Sydney. I was raised by my mum, Mary, and she was very vocal in allowing me to express myself and be just who I want to be. So I grew up, doing jazz and tap and dance and singing, and music was kind of, it was a more personal thing for me at first. It was a way for me to express myself and release emotions, because sometimes I find I'm shit at explaining things with my words when I'm speaking to someone, but I can put that in a song and it'll make it a lot easier. So yeah, I started writing songs in my room just on the guitar, but I was hella shy, so I would just like close the door, just keep it down. If they're coming, if anyone's walking, just I didn't want people to hear my voice, I was shy. So it was really a process for me to come into my own, know who I was, and also want to share that with people. I went to a performing arts school because I played the clarinet, because I couldn't play the sax because they already had that in the band. So I got into a performing arts school, Newtown, in Sydney, and I did dance and acting there, and still the nerves thing was like debilitating to me. I would never want to like sing to a big audience. I'd be cool like in a choir or like in the background, but music was still something that I loved, and it was so close to me. And in my personal life, like at home, I'd be like doing it all the time, but it was something where I was like, I need to cross a barrier here. And when I left high school, I was kind of like, damn man, these nerves, I need to shake them. So it was a process, I forced myself into it and through the nerves. And it's really funny because when you just have to face something head on, there's no turning back, man. It's like, you're there, you got to do this. You'll fuck it up, but that's okay. So yeah, I just kept performing, kept learning, kept growing. And eventually something switched in me, and I was confident and comfortable sharing these songs with people and doing what I love to do by myself for other people, with other people. So I've just been performing and writing and doing music and learning who I am, learning what I love, and yeah.
That's sick. Neil, when did it all start for you?
Yeah, so I grew up in a small township by the name of Marupana, alongside a larger township by the name of Shepparton, a couple of hours north of Melbourne. And growing up when I did in that particular part of the world, there were not many constructed identities of what Indigenous success really looked like, and probably one of the very few pathways was sports. And so myself, wanting to be successful as an Indigenous person, even as a young person, kind of went along with this status quo operation, which was one of the very few things on the table growing up in a rural centre. And I think I got to about 16, 17 and began to feel really disturbed by the fact that this was what was presented to us, and basically because it was the only thing. And I knew that there was something much more deeper that I should be doing, something much more powerful that I should be engaged in, and that involved my voice, not a colonially constructed voice or an edifice of that being something such as sport. And so I found myself beginning to write poetry at that point in time?
I feel like there is a bit of an arching theme with a few of you, especially Jennifer. I've read. Sorry, I know you're pouring water right now, but yeah, I read that you take inspiration from, amongst other things, journalistic poetry. Thandi, you talk about being able to write, finding writing for music easier than expressing yourself. Sos as well, as a music journalist and as a writer. Do you think, was there a time where you found your voice? Was it something that you found your voice in, or was it something that helped you find your voice and that was the step into becoming or doing whatever it took to be necessary? I don't know what I'm saying right now, sorry. I just heard a car drive past and got completely distracted. Were these the stepping stones to where you're all at now? That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah. Writing, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, writing was maybe my second outlet next to like playing the piano, which is what I grew up doing. I remember like when I was 14, I found out that my dad was cheating on my mother, and that was devastating at the time. And also I was asked to keep it a secret. And so like that was my outlet. Like I just couldn't find any way to cope besides writing, and I just wrote so much poetry, and that helped me so much. And it still does. I can only ever write when I'm upset, and it's still like the best form for me.
I think it's definitely been a cathartic thing for me. Growing up with dance as my main kind of creative outlet was really good in terms of growing up personally. But I knew that I was never going to be a dancer. Like there were girls who I'd perform with who, you know, before they came into our group, they'd been doing ballet since they were like 4, so it was very much a thing. Whereas for me, it was a way to connect with my culture and also be around other people who looked like me, which I didn't get growing up in the western suburbs of Adelaide. But so when I got into writing, it was probably one of the first creative endeavours that I felt completely and utterly in control of, if that makes sense. Like nobody, I mean, of course you have editors and stuff like that, but you know, when you're first starting to be approached because you write a certain way and you're being approached positively for it, that was a real catalyst for me. That was just like, okay, there is a space for this. And I could be as personal with it as I wanted to be, or I could instead tell other people's stories that wasn't, that you wouldn't be able to get in a press release. And that's something that I still, that's my favourite part of the job today. Whether or not it's an artist that nobody knows about, or whether or not it's, you know, one of the biggest names on a festival, it's telling that story and having that control over it, that still ticks it off for me, and it has done since I was about 15. Yeah.
Something that you just brought up, which brings me to my next question, is it seems like being able to write as an initial starting point gives you all the ability to take control of yourself in the way that you see where you belong, or what or to create what you see and hasn't been represented for you as a staple growing up. So I guess a question to all of you would be, creatively or professionally, was there enough representation for you when you first entered or thought about being in the field that you are now in?
Definitely there was, so in writing poetry, there were no examples of Indigenous poets that were out there in the world at the time, and it's really beautiful how you spoke about like the power of writing, how important that was, and that very stilling motion that it could create, the power. It was just maybe something a lot of Indigenous people before, or that I could find, ever had the ability to find that sense of stillness, to come to a particular place to create, from that place to maybe begin to go on to a point of empowerment.
So for me, I grew up, my mum raised me. She's white Australian and she's got Celtic heritage, and my father's South African. I connected with him when I was 8 years old and we grew our relationship from there. But when I was younger, I definitely don't feel, especially in Australia, that there was enough representation. I think, you know, the constant, sneaky sound system.
Oh my
Like,
God.
okay. That was it. Like, people would just draw me. And then I was like, there was Fuzzy, Faustina, and then there was, and there was. So, you know, I think it was something that I didn't see a lot of, but I knew that it was funny for me because, I was raised by a white mother and everyone around me was predominantly white, and my family that I had contact with was white here. I was always kind of, you know, different. But to that extent, you know, I have cousins that are half Australian, half Japanese, so we kind of were just like a melting pot. I didn't see it as much. It was when I was starting to like grow up and understand things, and people would call me out and be like, "Are you adopted?" For simple things, like, you know what I mean? So there wasn't enough representation, especially at that stage. I think I had to look towards America more for. I connected with like Alicia Keys. Of course, Scary Spice. So there was not enough, but I think it was something that I held on to, those people, and I tried to just continue to be me and find my path in this world.
I was going to say, it's what you're saying harps onto like my experience as well. I look to America, which I think is probably why for me, I know that led me to singing, because for me to be able to see powerful black women that were respected or could hold an audience, it was to see a black female performer, and for the most case they came from America. And Alicia Keys, definitely hear you on that. And like Scary Spice is responsible for how I made friends throughout primary school because I was the only black person.
Yeah,
and
100%.
It's and I guess as well, other people, as I got older, which is happening to me more now, I don't get the adoption thing. I get, and Lucie and I have spoken about this on this stage before, that we get mistaken for our parents' partner. So when I'm with my dad, they think I'm his younger wife, and I've been travelling with my mum and they thought I was her partner. Wow. And we've even had to like tell hotels, no, we want separate rooms because that's my mum, not my sugar mama, my literal mama who's standing next to me. It is an interesting thing, and I think it also gives you space to create what's not there, right? Have you felt that even though that there has been no representation, it also gives you every option to define yourself, which I think a lot of people don't have. Definitely. And how has that been for you? Or did that realization happen for you straight away, or was it something that has ticked over just recently?
For me, it was a process. Like, I think everything stemmed from just me learning to love myself, because you cannot wait for everyone else to love you because you'll be waiting your whole damn life, you know what I'm saying? So that process, it was me learning to love myself and not allowing other people to define me or for other people to box me in and try to shape me. I was just like, you know what, this is me, and I'll learn by doing, and I'll express myself how I want to. And just not allowing other people to hold you down or to try to tell you who you are. Because everything is based on personal experience. You know, people could look at us and be like, oh, you know, they're mixed race girls, like they've had the same life, they've gone through the same shit. Like everyone is completely different, and it's based on so many different factors.
I didn't realise, and I don't know if it's the same for you mob too. I didn't realise until, you know, only a handful of years ago how much we internalise about this process. Like it's not until somebody mentions that I look different, or mentions, oh, it's so great to have you on a lineup like this, like we need more of it. It's not until somebody actually says it that I'm like, oh yeah, that's the thing, because you deal with it every single day and it kind of becomes a bit normalised, and you take it in because it's like, okay, cool, I look different, I have a million more pressing things to be worrying about. You know, I got to get this done. I got to get this secured. So for me, that I'd say it's been more gradual for me, for sure.
I think it'd be interesting to hear your perspective from the journalistic side as well, because I know that even sometimes music journalists can become too obsessed with representation.
Totally.
And I'm thinking back to a review of Mojo Juju's album where the person who reviewed it became kind of obsessed with her cultural background, but in a really disrespectful way. And obviously just didn't understand the language that they should have been using, or perhaps if they should have been using it at all. Yeah. So do you think that happens a bit too much in journalism with representation?
I think people are too scared now. I feel like where there should be a balance in language, it's kind of, the pendulum has swung too far. And that's where you get reviews like that. They're written by writers who, as well-intentioned as they are, it's like they've gone to the handbook of how to be the most woke or the most correct, and they've just pulled from it. So that's probably one of the biggest challenges I face as a professional as well, because I feel like, there'll be people who will ask me to write on certain albums because I must have a connection with Solange because we're both brown. I wish I had a more deeper connection with Solange. If anyone knows how, hit me up. But it's that thing of how do we write and comment on art that kind of satiates all these cultural boxes. And they're cultural boxes that have been set up by people who are not from that culture most of the time. So I might seem kind of blasé or kind of aloof about certain things, where it's just like, no, I don't feel threatened by it because I've had to live it, you know? It's cool, like it's totally chill. If you're not, if I'm the first Samoan woman you've ever met, that's totally fine. That's dialogue about it. You don't need to be like, oh my God, I've never, this is so cool. Like, I'm not expecting you to. Like, do you know what I mean? And I feel like that's kind of filtered a lot into the professional space as well. It's just like, oh, well, I didn't know. It's like, it's okay not to know. We're not saying you should come into it with all this assumed knowledge, but just have a think about it. If you don't know, ask. We're not going to bite your heads off.
I'd love to hear your take on this, Neil, because I know that identity is a strong part of your music and even your radio program as well. It's really powerful for you. Do you find that sometimes journalists are asking questions or making assumptions that they just shouldn't be putting on paper about you?
Yeah, definitely. There is quite a bit of that I see, and it is that, really difficult space for Indigenous peoples where we've had so much of a great lack of representation to now where we're getting represented a lot more in different media sources, and I think there's a natural tendency maybe for some artists to maybe not be entirely happy with the work that's being created and defining them, but because it's representation, still accepting it. And for example, again and again, Indigenous artists described as Indigenous Australian artists, and it proliferates print media in this country to the point where probably at least 80 to 90% of documents that I see written about Indigenous people within music will often have Indigenous Australian defined in there, and it's a classic case of this ownership that there has been taking of the Indigenous platform within that space as well, in the way that a couple of the others have already been speaking to, in terms of us not being able to determine our own space within not only participating in these platforms, but the actual structures that we put around that, which is certainly a reason that I've chosen to do radio, to be able to present Indigenous artists in a way that's not even based upon my perspective as an Indigenous person, but to allow them the self-determination to come onto my show and have a 45-minute interview where they define the terms of what their identity is completely and utterly.
And I imagine after a conversation that's 45 minutes, if a journalist does their research well and listens back to other conversations that they've had, they'll move forward and kind of address them correctly, I imagine.
One would hope.
That's the hope.
When it comes to representation, what does that term mean to you? Because I feel like it's thrown upon probably all of us from time to time. Is it a race? Is it a culture? Or is your idea of representation broader than that? And how do you navigate it in your work? And do you even want to navigate it? Is it something that's been pushed on you? I think I say her name wrong every time. Alethea? Is it Alethea? She's on. What? Alethea? Yes, thank you. Alethea Beeson said, I was like born into politics, and I feel like at the time that we are now, we could probably all argue that we're born into the diversity politics that is happening socially right now. So when I guess people call on you in order to have representation, how do you navigate that? And do you see yourself as being a part of representation? Is it something that you consciously think of in your work? Do you actually have a connection to that, or is it just something ambiguous that we tend to be grouped in?
From an Indigenous perspective, again, we are at a point in the world where I acknowledge a lot of people want to be able to do the right thing in terms of representation, but obviously there becomes a great danger with that in terms of the dangers of tokenizing and latching on to a certain individual who can be seen to embody that. And I think that we've seen that in spades in the past few years, and it kind of gets to a point where people no longer feel an urgency to continue to dig deeper into what the diversity of not only that identity but other identities within that particular ethnic group of people, which in the Indigenous case is 500 plus nations.
Jennifer, you were going to answer that before.
Yeah, I think kind of just like the idea of like tokenism, when there are more people that look like me doing different things, is kind of like when we'll get to somewhere where like people are like, oh, like there can be like an Asian person who does good at this as well as does this as well as does that. But until the point if you just stop, you're like, oh, well, we've got Peggy Goo, that's great, we're done. Like that's fine. And like that's when you get people being like, oh, well, so I guess all Asian people are like that because I see that. In the same way that like black people are racialized and like mostly seen doing crimes, and so therefore you assume so.
Yeah.
But that's because they're not shown in different lights, and so. What was the representation question again?
How do you feel about representation, and what does it mean to you? I think a lot of times in social political ways, or even in festival lineups, it's ticking a box.
That's
of
the whole thing. Like I don't
things.
like I'm Asian, I'm gay, and I'm female. I don't ever think about those things until like someone backstage at a festival is like, oh, it's so great to have you. Like I know that, and then I realize that my diversity is actually like quite a draw point. But when I'm like making music, or when I'm like, I don't like wake up today and be like, oh great, yes, these things. Yeah. Because you just like I forget. Like I remember when I was little, I was just like, wait, what? I'm Asian? Oh, whoops. So yeah, I think it's something that people like you don't see it until you're shown a mirror and you're like, oh, right. Yeah. And then I think you're like auto-balloted into the talk of representation because you are a minority, and there are very few that are in the public realm, and so in entering like music, like something that is public facing, you kind of are automatically entered into being part of the representation conversation. Yeah.
I think it's a good it's a good conversation to like. I'm more than happy to be having that conversation.
Right.
I don't want to talk about it at all.
I'm not saying that you're not happy to, but I guess like for a lot of us, we grew up feeling very invisible in this country, and then all of a sudden it's like, hey, we need to talk to black people. Get on stage, talk about your life. I mean,
like when I say that I'm happy to talk about it, it's more like for the longest time, I never thought of myself as kind of being worthy to talk about it. I was
when did that change for you?
It did change probably when I went to my first American festival, and I was actually mixing with a more diverse crew of people. Like, so obviously I'm going over there as an Australian, but I'm also going over there as a person of colour, and having to, not educate is the wrong word, but having to kind of explain to Americans how this happens, because they're just like, oh, well, A, you've got minimum wage, what's that? And B, also, like, so your mom's white, but your dad's Samoan, does that mean you're related to The Rock? Like, you know, those sorts of things. So it's another level of explaining. So when I came back, I was just like, oh, okay, cool. Like, I can talk about this stuff, and it's okay, you know?
That is how, like, North America, because I grew up in North America, that is how it is approached, though. It's like, what's that? How did you turn it like that? Tell me.
And it's completely different.
And it's nice, though, because no one's scared.
So nice.
Yeah.
You know, they're genuinely wanting to know.
And you genuinely learn because you take risks and you ask questions.
Yeah, 100%.
Versus here, everyone's scared to get yelled at, or like, I don't know, they're just scared. And so like, the learning stops because no one's asking any questions.
Definitely. I think,
or not asking what they really want to know, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's the not asking. I know, like, I guess within a lot of communities that I'm around, we've moved on from the where are you from question. But that is, especially in Australia, code for why are you black?
Yeah.
Or like, why don't you sound like the way that we thought you sounded like from looking at you? It's definitely, people go, oh, where are you from? And you're like, oh, I was born here. And they're like, no, really, where are you from? You're like,
where?
My mum, like, I don't know, what do you want to know?
I feel like just most recently I've been finding, I've been not getting more outrage than normal, but with the whole Israel Folau thing that's been happening in the news, like, there's so much kind of vitriol and a new kind of focus around the idea of religion and I guess its place in the Polynesian community, which from an outsider looking in, if you've not known anything about how deeply ingrained religion has been in the colonisation of the Pacific Islands, then it would be fucking daunting to look at. You'd be like, people didn't treat people like that. That can't be right, but it is. So I've found I've been talking to many more people about where that extreme level of thinking comes from, because some of the reactions I've had to this whole Israel thing is it's almost like, without directly saying, I'm surprised he thinks like that because he's also from a marginalised community, that's the vibe. And it's like, okay, but there are layers.
Yeah.
There's layers to cultural trauma, and there's layers to cultural trauma and also being in the public eye as he is. You know, it's very rare that you'll get a person of colour, particularly a Polynesian, a young Polynesian person, on such a lucrative platform with no guidance whatsoever. So his responses are always going to be measured by a quote-unquote Anglo standard of what he's been born into. And although I do not hold the same views as him, I can understand where he's coming from in terms of being like, why are people reacting like this?
Yeah.
Because my community's, like, I go to church every Sunday and sit there for 4 hours while somebody preaches the same stuff that's been preached to my parents and that's been preached to my grandparents. Like that, those are the conversations I'm having now, and I'm really happy to be having them, because it's like, okay, here we can actually start to break down the stuff that people like us go through every day, you know?
Exploring the complexity instead of, like Neil was saying, that, you know, people just think, oh, there's Indigenous, and they don't think 500 different groups kind of thing. Thandi, I know that you travelled to Africa, I'm not sure exactly when, but semi-recently, 2013. What was it like travelling there for you, given you grew up in Australia but you have this South African connection?
It was quite a moving experience for me, because obviously I hadn't met any of my family over there, and growing up here, you know, in a predominantly white society, getting there, I was like, damn, this feels good. Like, you know, when you're just like around like people that look like you and all that stuff. And then it was weird, because it was like, oh, on the flip side of it, and then I was like the white girl. So I was like, it's a very funny world that I think, you know, mixed race, biracial people live in. It's like, where do I belong? It's like, I'm too white to be black and I'm too black to be white. besides that, though, I had an incredible experience. I think it just brought everything back home to me, and it made me realise how goddamn grateful I am. And the experiences that I've had here, I've been very lucky to have the life that I have. It made me, when I come back, just want to go harder and take every opportunity and not sit back, and really make me want to pursue my art. Because I have, my family over there is not in a great position, financially and health-wise and everything. So it really just made me appreciate what I've been given and how lucky I have been in this life. Yeah.
Do the rest of you feel that way, like that they're like returning to place? I know, Neil, you and I have talked about your experience of returning to country to recharge. What does that do for you as an artist, and does that reinforce what you're doing creatively for you?
Absolutely. My art is very much driven by that connection, and for me, the authenticity that I can bring to my art cannot exist without that return to my ancestral homelands, most definitely.
Your music and the lyrics specifically of your music is very powerful, and I feel like even if somebody had a very basic knowledge of indigeneity and Australia, would really get the message on your stance when you're creating and performing. Has that ever for you come with a sense of fear? And how has that experience been for you? Because in the panel before, we talked about the lack of representation and the disconnect that that Australians have with Indigenous people. Is there a fear to stand up and kind of point out the truth when you're either ignored or like historically have been ignored or historically been shut down one way or another?
Yeah, I definitely feel that for an Indigenous person who is not empowered around, particularly sovereignty is the key driver behind my work, and the continued meaning and importance of Indigenous sovereignty within the society. But it took me a while to arrive at that place. I was not always at that place, and again, coming back to country, I was very blessed to, after getting to my mid-20s or so, to be able to return home and actually work within a community organisation for my people, where a primary role that I had, which was to speak to the cultural importance of our people, to continue responsibility to uphold our duties as custodians of country and custodians of culture and all living beings within our country. But without that particular opportunity, I wouldn't have got to the place to be able to speak fearlessly. So it was by knowing responsibility that eradicated fear. But a lot of Indigenous people are not empowered in that point to be able to recognise that they have an inherent responsibility as somebody with up to 100,000 plus years connection to this land. But my music is also very spiritual, and I trust the ancestral connection that comes through in my work as well, and fear doesn't exist when it relates back to connection to ancestors. But that's not the experience of all Indigenous people creating art here in the now. It's not the norm even.
Jennifer, you touched on when you were talking about when you first kind of entered the club scene as a person who loved dancing, and I guess there is a connection there as well with the club scene in Melbourne and in Sydney, of creating communities that are not necessarily out there in the daylight hours. How has that experience been for you, from going to someone who attends these things to being a DJ and creating those spaces for other people to come into?
I guess I'm really grateful for the way that I came into it was being a dancer, and so I know what I'm trying to create and I know what feeling I'm trying to create, I guess. And so the switch over has been quite nice, I guess, because I guess whilst there's a lot of things in Melbourne to go to, I'm looking for a specific sound that I can't always find, and it's nice to be able to facilitate that yourself. And yeah, I mean, does that answer the question? Sorry, I just...
Yeah, no, it does. I guess it's like, I guess especially like now going from being a punter to then being able to be in these spaces and give people an experience there must be times where you feel like it has this kind of full circle effect of, the experience of coming into this space, and you have the potential of that being a stranger walking into one of your sets or going out with friends and being introduced to this whole environment. And I was kind of wondering, like, not putting it all on you, but how do you ensure, as someone that's gone from novice to a person within the industry, how do you ensure that culture and that inclusivity continues?
I mean, it's like, not that I don't, like, I still love clubbing so much. You'll still find me in the clubs, like, most weekends dancing anyways. And so I guess in the whole thing where, like, I'm not just a DJ, I still go out and I support the scene, and I, like, go to the shows that I want to see, and I support people who I respect. I'm still not sure if I'm, like, actually understanding what you're asking me.
No, you are. Don't worry.
Okay.
Let's change things up.
Okay.
I feel like at all stages, for everyone as like a sweeping statement, I feel like we come up to, we face like barriers or face challenges. I know, Thandi, you were saying before the nervousness of like not wanting to perform in front of people or writing and not wanting anyone to hear and pushing through. How has the rest of the couch experienced that? Has the moments of pushing through? And do you think that's had an effect on, do you think that's a characteristic of just who you are in hindsight, being able to look back on moments of adversity? Or do you think it's something that you've had to kind of build yourself up to?
Definitely building yourself up to. I feel like we've all had those moments where, even if it's not explicitly stated, you've been told that you're not enough for one reason or another. For me personally, I feel like, again, like I was raised by my mum as well, a white Australian lady, and my parents divorced when I was 10, and I feel like that was a big thing. Like, in some way they were telling me that I wasn't enough to make that work, even though it's very not true. But growing up in a household where I was the different one and seeing what my mum went through, again, the adoption sorts of trains of thinking, or, the assumptions that she was only with a Samoan guy for the exoticism of having a chocolate baby. That's something that's actually been said to her in the past.
I think in AbFab we're referred to
as
Chanel babies.
Yeah, exactly.
Or designer babies.
Yeah. So I feel like that kind of, that always stuck with me growing up, and then, because she always taught, I feel like I get my independent nature from her. She was always the one who was just like, okay, you want to change your uni degree to go and write about music and go follow bands, go for it. If it doesn't work out, try something different. So I got that from her. But again, it was always that sense of, if I fail at this, then that's not doing enough. So I should only aim within my immediate means. And I still feel like that there's still some of that sticks with me now. But now I've been able to get over it a lot easier. Now I'm not sure what it's been like for you guys.
I mean, I was also like cripplingly shy when I was younger, and it was my dad who actually like would force me into these uncomfortable positions. He's like, if you don't ask for anything in this life, you're not going to get anything, and that's stuck with me. I think probably has carried me through, and I don't think that there was ever a point where I felt like I broke through. I think it's like this constant, like, depending on what day you wake up, you either feel like you're on top or you just feel like you're way down under. And then, I don't know, you just keep working towards something, and then you like look back and you're like, oh wow, I've actually climbed this far up or I've gone this far, and it's kind of nice, but you don't really realize that you've been doing that.
So you just reminded me, like, just on a performance aspect, like, as I was a very shy kid too, and you know, when you're performing, your early years of performing, I don't know about you guys, but I used to hate being told that I was doing well. Like, I hated it. Or if, you know, people, especially when I'd be in like full traditional Samoan wear, they'd be like, "Oh my God, you're so pretty." I'd be like, Don't. That's honestly why I, like, my mentors, my dance mentors would be on my case, because I would never smile when I was young, because I was concentrating so much, and I hated that attention being put on me.
Yeah.
And it was really awkward. I hated it. I hated the fact that the thing that I'd grown up with people commenting so much on as a young kid, that, "Oh, you look so different, you know, blah, 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 blah," was then being switched into a positive, and I didn't know how to deal with that. I still don't know how to deal with that. I hate it, but I'm like, "Oh, thank you." Like, I'm still really uncomfortable in saying thank you for acknowledging something, because I've just grown up being like, nah. I don't like it. But it is like that shyness kind of manifests itself in a lot of different ways for different reasons, I think.
I think my parents, this is kind of related, but not really. My parents always reminded me, also because they were immigrants to Canada. They were always like, "You have to do better than these white kids. Like, you just have to. We did not come here and sacrifice all of this for you to fuck it up." So. But and I think that's probably somewhere back there, like, pushing me forward.
How does DJing play into your life? Because
they're actually not the traditional Asians that you would think. So they're actually quite happy for me at the moment.
Yeah.
But then you go, like, you know, you go back into representation, and like Asian representation, like, what? Growing up, there's no one, like, what, like, yeah, I could be a nerdy Chinese kid who's good at math.
Yeah.
Or that's like it, basically. And it was like such a weird thing, because like it made me, even though like I grew up in a school of like mostly East, South, and West Asians, still I felt the need to like reject my language completely, to the point where I was like, no, I'm going to learn English. I'm going to learn it very well. And I was trying to figure out why that was, and I think it's because like I watched my parents struggle, and I watched like we used to call them fobs, like fresh off the boat. Like
Still do.
Yeah, we still do. Okay, cool. Just checking. And I used to watch those kids at my school, and I'd be like, I don't want to be treated like a second-rate citizen. I'm gonna like assimilate, because that's how I learned to survive, and I'm just gonna get really good at being Western, I guess.
Do you think I know for myself, like, I took it an extra step. It was like, not only will I be good at this, I will be better than you. Like,
yeah,
I wanted to...
Totally.
It could just be because I'm maniacal, but I just wanted people to be underneath, like...
My teacher in grade 1 told me that my English was poor.
Yeah.
So then I was like, oh no. So then I just went and I read a book, like I like just read the most books that year. And then anyways, yeah, very competitive.
I got put in an ESL class in year 3 because...
That's embarrassing too.
It is really embarrassing. My teachers couldn't work out why I was doing so well. Oh, and at that point, my mum, she was, what do you call it? Like teacher's aide. She was doing some of those classes, and she was in a class, and they were like, "Oh, she's doing so well," and she's like, "Well, she was born here. Of course, she's going to do it." Like,
she speaks English. That's probably
like,
why.
Yeah, they was just like, "Oh, we can't get over it," and she was just like, "Can you not have my child in an English as a second language class?" Like, it's incredible. No one had told her it had happened. They're like, "Oh, maybe she just needs some more help."
I've had a similar... I had a teacher say, "Oh, you're doing so well considering this is your second language."
Yeah.
And then angrily told her that it wasn't, and then saw that my marks dropped for the next few assignments. So I think I was getting some pity marks that were leaning into that.
Neil, do you connect with some of the things that people are saying there? Do you feel like that's a theme you can connect with?
Yeah, definitely. And some of what I was feeling we were getting to is that difficulty in the decision making of how you present yourself, and going back to what Nkechi was asking earlier in terms of like, where does fear potentially arise for an Indigenous person? And I feel something that can be quite overlooked is also the fear of how you present yourself culturally in a way that's still going to have integrity when there's an expectation of potentially presenting your art form or whatever it may be in a way that's acceptable and digestible for Western constructs. So the actual compromise that many Indigenous artists potentially are internally having to be able to use the English language, for example, versus being able to just sit on country and sing all of your sacred, beautiful songs. This is a contemporary issue. This was not an issue pre-colonization. So it's a challenge that every single Indigenous artist, I could imagine, would potentially grapple with this. Why do I have to present something that's relevant and potentially influencing the constructs that are imposing upon us in the now versus the beauty of the alternative?
Yeah. Do you think our approach now is changing when it comes to representation? I'm saying this with full awareness that there is a world stage at this festival that I want to burn down.
And there's a tribal wear stall as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I see artists like Baker Boy, for example, who is singing to crowds of people who are 15, 16, younger, who are singing in language back to him, whether they know what he's saying or not. Do you think that that is a sign of a social shift, or are we still milling about and just trying to tick boxes?
I feel that there's a shift, but it is a very cautious shift from those that have the plethora of the power within their control at the moment. It's a beautiful thing that the shift is occurring. Don't get me wrong whatsoever. It's incredible that somebody like Baker Boy could be on the main stage tonight and he would be the hottest act here at this festival. It's an incredible thing, but there could be 25 other Indigenous artists on these stages who have an amazing power about them as well that would be equally as powerful if people appreciated the depths of what's being presented to them through a lens that is not the Western lens that even they've been trained to view things through, which is not enabling them the greatest opportunity to actually understand what's being presented in front of them. So the shift is occurring, but what I perceive is there's a shift on how much the shift is enabled.
Yeah, that's valid.
Yeah, I feel like people are asking for it, and I guess the white people who like hold the power are tentatively like letting in because they feel like they have to. And hopefully in time that will kind of like get degraded, like eroded enough so that more like there's just more minorities visible. I think that's how it's gonna go.
Yeah.
Like in the this is the DJ scene. Like we had like a few years ago we had like one big like Asian DJ. Her name is Peggy Goo, and then now there's like a few.
Yeah.
And just well, you know, like 4 years ago I was in Sydney and someone was like, "Oh my God, it's Peggy Goo," and they're like pointing at me, and I was just like, "What?" Which like I don't think that would happen now.
Yeah.
So I think there's it's slow, but there's something happening. And even like, you know, you go into movies like Hollywood, like I watched Crazy Rich Asians in the plane like a few weeks ago, and I cried my eyes out because I just have never seen so many Asian like different personalities, and they're like so beautiful and so glamorous, and like seeing like the Asian male like actually not be emasculated and actually look sexy, like that has never happened before either. Yeah. So and yeah, you know, like Black Panther as well, of course.
Yeah.
So I think it's happening.
I definitely think so. I think it's a good thing that people are becoming less shocked when they see, you know, people of colour, especially in music, doing things outside of the genre that they should be in. Like, you know, there probably would have been a time where Polynesian meant New Zealander exclusively, and we were either rugby players, bouncers, or hip hop artists who were Scribe. Shout out to Scribe, he's sick. But like there were certain lanes that we fell into, and I feel like only in the last maybe 10 or 20 years has that started to change from the ground up. Like if you know, 10 years ago, you wouldn't be able to tell me that one of the biggest rock bands in the country was led by a Samoan, had a lead guitarist who was Fijian, bass player who was Maori, Pākehā, drummer Polish Australian, and keyboardist Korean American. One of the biggest bands, Gang of Youths, one of the biggest rock bands in Australia. None of them identify as white Australian. Like, if that had happened 10 years ago, it would have been like, you're joking, you know? And we're seeing it, like, there are some amazing artists like Tiana Kasi in Melbourne coming through. Then you do have the hip-hop set like Jeswa. All the, you know, the Brisbane kind of hip-hop scene at the moment is popping, and it's incredible because it's not the sort of hip-hop that people are used to hearing. It's you know, some of it is political, some of it is more 90s influence with the R&B. There's, you know, it's an incredible melting pot now, and I really like that people aren't necessarily taken aback by being like, oh, there's a brown guy in a rock band. It's just like, okay, cool, that's, you know, that's how it is. Like, have you found that as well?
Yeah, I feel like now in society, more than ever, it's a great time for us to be able to identify exactly who we are. You know, there's too many boxes now we can tick, and we're able to create the spaces that we want that haven't been there before. And yeah, we're able to. The change is slow. Change is always going to take goddamn time. And yesterday, I was at the footy, like the first female referee. I was like, this moment, you go, how has that not happened yet? But there's still things that are taking so long to happen. But it's amazing that has happened. You know, she's now opened the door for so many more females to come through and do what they are more than capable of doing. So I feel like there's always going to be people who will be saying, yeah, we need this, and we're going to pick you to tick that box. It's funny because when I was younger, I did like modelling and acting and all that stuff. And that's when I first learnt, like, there was a whole dance school full of, you know, white, blonde girls, brown hair, whatever. And there was one other Ghanaian chick. And I went to sign up and they're like, oh no, sorry, we already have that. So it's really taught me that nowadays it's great that there are more people, more exposure to different cultures, different races, different religions. And although some people are still just using that to tick the box, you know, we can still focus ourselves and know what we are, who we are, our cultural, our history, our identity, and make that lane for ourselves.
Has there ever been a time where you've caught yourself and realised, oh my God, I am totally this stereotype? Is it necessarily a bad thing, or can it be a good thing? Can you enjoy the irony of the situation?
I find that when this is, again, I'm stereotyping, but I know for me it's whenever I'm visiting my dad's family in Brisbane, I develop an accent. Like, I only need to be there for a week, but I'm all of a sudden talking the same broken English my dad does. And it feels oddly comforting. I only ever realise it when I come back home and I'm like, oh, I'm really I'm being incredibly invasive in your personal space, because we're very kind of, you know, talking with your hands and hugging and being like, Nkechi, you look way too skinny, why are you not eating? Like, you know, that's just a normal conversation.
You just triggered me back to being 12-year-old at an African event.
Like, there's weird guilt.
Meat guilt, yeah.
Yeah. So sometimes I have to be like, oh, well, what are you doing? But it's just like, yeah, it's, you know, it is what it is.
My brother plays bass, and the way he learnt how to play bass was he joined a band and he got told that he has to play bass because he'll be good at it, and that's literally what he did. And when that episode of South Park came out with Token, I was like, Emeka, it's you. Like, this is literally how you got into music. And he's like, I know, it's hectic. And he plays basketball and he's good at every sport that he tries. Yeah. But it's like something we can laugh at. Obviously, it's like a positive stereotype. Totally. But I guess a lot of the time we talk about the negative stereotypes that are put on us. And I think there's two sides to that coin. Obviously, not all true. That's why they're a stereotype. But I think there's some amusement to be had in being able to identify that some things are kind of, kind of true.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
I know when me and all my girls get together and it's like the black time thing,
Yeah.
and everyone's just like, yep, it's a thing now.
Yeah. The nod as well. Growing up, I don't know if you have that, but my dad used to nod if he saw another person of colour, and I'm finding myself doing it. Or just saying hello to people, and I'm not that warm, to be honest with
So I was
you.
like, how do you know them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
When my dad dropped me off at, I think it was to come to Splendour a few years ago. He dropped me off at the Gold Coast airport, and he started talking to one of the, like, just this dude who was on airport security because we were delayed. Like 5 minutes, found out that they were 2 villages apart. Back home. Did not know this guy from a virus. Ignored me the entire time. Brings him over and he was just like, oh yeah, so this is Faleki and his cousin is this cousin, and so that makes you related and this. And I was just like, I don't know this man. You know? And it's like, damn, like that does happen. Because there's this idea of like, oh, you know, you shouldn't date within your race because you might end up being related to one another. Or it's, I mean, not saying that that's true, but
it's...
there's a lot of village crossover, people. Like it's so funny. Like even with Dave from Gangs, who's like he's like my little brother. Like we found out that we have familial crossover going back like 3 times removed, and I'm like, God damn it, it keeps happening. But you know, we're all connected. It's all good.
I think you were talking about, you were starting to talk about change before I had to jump off the stage and attend to my baby. But I'd like to bring it back to that a bit, because I think you can't really talk about change without talking about the impact of social media. So I'd like to, I guess, get your perspectives on the positives and the frustrations of social media and how it's changed the scene. And that also draws into that representation conversation as well. You can find that representation on social media sometimes. But is that necessarily a positive? Has it had negative effects?
I think through social media, for myself personally, I think it's been cool. You know, you're able to find people who you can identify with so easily, and you know you can create your own world and hone in a channel of people who you think represent you and who you understand. I mean, we're not showing everything obviously on social media, but I think it's been positive for myself. I also, at the same time, I find myself hating social media just because it takes us away from the here and now. But I think to be able to connect with people and find people in your lane, it's been good for me.
Neil, I'd love to get your perspective on this, because I think you can find some really amazing communities online that you just don't necessarily find in your local community. What's your interaction been with it?
I've seen it being a very powerful tool, particularly, as Thandi said, in terms of representation or identifying and locating other people who you can connect to as an Indigenous person. Personally, I've found countless other Indigenous people who probably find a relative degree of safety within presenting a persona on a social media front, which then we're getting into the issue of tackling the intergenerational shame, which has been horrific and traumatic to the Indigenous experience. So that single factor alone, to be able to somehow peel back a bit of that experience is actually been quite phenomenal for the empowerment, particularly of a younger generation of Indigenous people, and to be able to first see each other not as this shy shell in the back corner, but as this proud, beautiful, glowing, beautiful person right in front of them where they're very directly connected to. So we're, again, back to the topic of Indigenous sovereignty. I think there is an act of sovereignty within that for peoples.
Jennifer, what's been your experience with that?
Sorry, I was just like listening to everyone speak, and like, yeah, it's great that we can like hone in on our communities, but just to play devil's advocate, like, does that kind of force us into groupthink then? And then do we then not expose ourselves to diversity and then because of that, become less understanding and less tolerant. And maybe that's how cancel culture came about, in a way that we were just so quick to be like, nah, you're trash because you don't know shit. And it's kind of nice that is actually kind of petering out now, that culture. But I wonder if that came from that.
Sos, I know you have a lot to say about cancel culture. How would you respond to that?
I think just from my own personal experience, I feel like there is still quite a ways to go in a creation of a nurturing and supportive culture, particularly with my community. Living in Melbourne, where in the particular pocket of Melbourne I live in, I barely see any Pacific Islanders. I think they're more on the other side of the river, which, let's be honest, like I'm very much in that north side pocket of not crossing at the moment. But it's only if I go to certain shows or if I go to certain people who I'm already friends with that there'll be that kind of welcoming nature there. But I feel like in the industry in particular, there's still quite a ways to go, which is where I think cancel culture does play into things, because it's like there are so few of us. If any one of us isn't representing a certain way, then you're automatically cancelled. Like there's no, if there is dialogue, there's not much of it, but at the moment, in my experience, I haven't really seen that. Yeah. So I feel like in turn, that kind of forces people to use their social media platforms in not the healthiest ways possible. Yeah. And it's not really progressing in that way.
When you take things offline with, I guess, keyboard crusaders or whatever, with the artists that are sitting here, I know there is a big push and there is a big movement to diversify lineups, but not to like pointedly diversify them.
Yeah.
Have you ever found yourself on a lineup that is not diverse enough, and have you been pushed to take part in cancel culture where you remove yourself from that lineup and therefore make it even less diverse, or in an attempt to end that event?
That happened. I played at this festival called Gay Times. I played last year, but this happened 2 years ago, where a bunch of POCs decided to just cancel it and kind of boycott it in a way. And I was listening to the dialogue and I was like, yes, 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 but then if I also leave and you also leave and you're like leaving right now, it's just gonna be white people. Like, shouldn't I stay here and like represent?
Yeah.
How do you navigate that? Because I've heard a lot, I haven't had it happen to myself, but I've heard from a lot of artists and spoken to a lot of artists about that. And how does it impact you as a performer and as a person, just as a person trying to do something that you're passionate about? And also perhaps represent yourself in order for other people to see you there.
Definitely tear you up a lot, knowing that you're aspiring to certain standards and you want to be able to hold industry that constructs these spaces to a standard of platform and inclusion and empowerment. And so if, for example, there's a lineup with 1,000 acts and I'm the only Indigenous act, that's clearly not okay. And trying to find a way to be able to make that lineup better is definitely my natural reaction to that. As a first step is to say, hey, have you thought about how else you can enhance this? Because as Jennifer was saying, if we remove ourselves from this space, then there's no representation at all. And I bring it back to Indigenous rights, is that we should be able to inhabit every single space across this sacred, beautiful land that is all Indigenous land. We should be present at every single event that is on Indigenous land somewhere or another. So there is I feel it's a benefit of Indigenous culture to give an extra strength to say we're going to remain present, but it's not without this minefield of things that can be going on internally in terms of, well, what does the rest of the people within your particular circle think and feel about this? And ultimately it will affect them emotionally if you do decide to still participate within this particular space that is not doing the baseline needs that it is needing to.
I guess there's still a struggle there then with the feeling the pressure of a community that you're potentially there to represent and wanting to actually be there to represent it. How do you navigate that?
Well, they can often be the ones to cut you down first, which is like such a weird phenomena where you're like, because you are representing just by default of being there and what you look like and what you are doing, you're supposed to represent them, and as soon as like they feel like you don't represent them, you get cut down, and it's, I don't.
Just not from an artist's perspective, but from somebody who is on the media side of things and watching it, like I get the anger, I really do. Like it's something that I've experienced quite frequently as well. But having talked to a lot of artists who have been affected by it, it's kind of similar to what you were saying, Nkechi. There's almost a fear that comes with thinking you need to pull yourself off a lineup to meet that kind of expectation of your community, but also the fear of being the person who decides to be like, okay, how can I make this better? How can I be that person to make a fucked up situation better for next year or something? And I get that not everybody wants to do that. I get that it's tiring because I think it was mentioned in the panel before, ultimately it's going to come down to us to affect change, right? Like we're the only ones who really know, the emotional labour that goes into this stuff as well. So we can't be told how to get over something. Ultimately, we're going to have to be the ones to come up with a system that adequately gets us through that period. So just on an industry standpoint, I kind of look at these situations and I'm like, we're kind of eating our own, Yeah, it's just like how do we as a community progress if it's
it's almost like we're supposed to be all facing in that direction, but you guys have decided to turn around and face me, and it's like, no guys, the battle's that way.
Exactly, like we're all
turn around.
It's an interesting time, and I really hope we do kind of move past this weird inward looking anger that still comes from us. What about you and your scene? Because I know that it is diversifying a lot, but there is also, I guess, a lot of expectation and pressure too.
Yeah, I haven't been put in this situation where there's been a lineup that I had to step down from, but if faced with that situation, I would think the best thing to do is to get up there and to be a face of someone who, if I was a younger girl looking up and going to a show that they can relate to, and I think it's important to, spread your message and to have, if there's a platform for you to do that, to take that and not back down. So I would definitely still go through with it. Yeah.
I was just doing a time check with Nkechi to see if we should move to questions. Yeah.
We've got 15.
Okay, I reckon it would be a good chance if anybody does have a question. Where is that? The box thing? Oh, sweet. Does anybody have a particular question they'd like to throw out there about representation, or I guess we've talked a bit about social media and also community as well. Throw up your hand and we'll throw the box to you.
At your face. No one, great.
There's a couple of points that made me think there. Firstly, I'm Jambi, I'm from the Gidabal and the Rakbal people of Northern Rivers. Just come off the stage up the front there doing Welcome to Country with the Elders. One of the things I find, I think is you sort of got close to touching on it, but not quite, and I think it's a really important thing, is when we're out there doing the work as the new generation is stepping forward as the next step in our ancestry, when it comes to being judged by the people, by our own people who are sitting in the trauma of colonisation and don't know that they're still there, like they understand they're still there, but they don't know that they're acting from that, And we actually can see that. We can look back and go, yeah, we can see that you're in your trauma, but I'm not going back into that to be like you. I've got to stand up here out the front, or stand up here in the face of it all in a way that you're not able to right now. And I still want your love and support, brothers and sisters. But please understand, I'm not out here pretending I'm better than you. Yeah. I'm part of your struggle. I'm part of your story. Just because I can talk English better to these people, I can look at these people in the eye and not get racist, not be triggered by racism, but see it as their racism is their ignorance. That I've gone through the healing processes enough in myself, in my own time, to be able to stand here and have this decent conversation with these people and help shift the major battles and the major traumas in their people as well as ours, and the way they look at us. That small point there of when we're judged by our people, like Sister said about being cut down, they're the first ones to cut us down. Is it the same for the rest of the cultures that are represented here? That when we're taking that next step, and we've had to recognise that we're actually born to do that next step. We're not. Some of us aren't brought up in community, so we're not mission-bred mentality. It's a hard thing to say, but it kind of is what it is, you know. But I say that back in the mission as well. When I go back there and we've got meetings with council and they want to come in and they're treating us like that and we're bowing to that. And so unfortunately some of the elders have got to bow to that because they're the ones carrying the biggest trauma. But for me to stand up and say, oh, have a look around our community, what do you see? And the elders feel like that's home. But I say, this is a freaking prison. This is a jail. We got to free ourselves from that. So obviously I understand what I'm talking about when it comes to this, but I'm very interested in how that feels for everyone else, especially from different countries as well, from Tonga and places like that. When it comes to the trauma that so much coloured people and Indigenous people from around the world have suffered, it's a good thing, I feel, that we're separate. The ones who are standing up, we're pushed, we're sort of forced. It's like having a fire lit under you to get out there and do it, but at the same time holding that love and respect for the people at home, even if they're going, who do you think you are, all this sort of shit. You know? But how does that feel for everybody else?
So for myself, I definitely feel the gap it's a generational thing. So my dad's South African, and from him I kind of got a bit of, attitude about me wanting to be a singer, because to him it's just like, oh yeah, you want to be their showgirl, you want to get up and show the white men a good time and entertain them, just be there for that. And so that was kind of hard for me, because for me, music is what feels good to my soul, you know what I mean? But I think with people my age group, thankfully I've had a great experience, that I get praise and I feel warmth and love from my peers. So I think 100% it's a generational thing, and I hope that, they will learn to understand that as things move, as things grow, we're not doing this to, oppress our people or to try go backwards, and we're doing this to show who we are and show that we can continue to grow and respect who we are, who our culture is, who our ancestors in the modern world. Yeah.
I feel like my understanding of racism is quite different to my mother's understanding of racism. So I would say that her understanding of racism is very much that kind of go back to where you came from, name calling, all that kind of stuff. Whereas I look at the little intricate things as well, like the where are you from question, which ultimately is like, why are you here, that kind of stuff. And so I find that's the generational difference for me, that I'm noticing these little microaggressions that mum's generation didn't necessarily notice. And when I talk to her about it, she'll say, oh, no, I didn't experience racism when I moved to Australia. But then if I say, but did people constantly ask you where you were from, or, you know, they didn't want you as their nurse, for example, because she was a nurse, she would say, yeah, that did happen. So for me, it's the intricacies that have changed with generations. That's my take on it.
Yeah, I feel for me, it's been something that I've been dealing with for the last few years in particular, because in terms of me growing up and getting into music and doing what I'm doing, I've been very lucky in having the total support from my dad, because he's my link back home. He's my link to my cultural heritage. But for him, it's more, you know, I'm the first university-educated woman on his side of the family. I'm the first, you know, woman who's kind of brought it out into doing what I'm doing. So he's quite proud of that. However, there are the trauma from his upbringing in being brought up in a very, very religious household by way of the missionaries' colonization of the Samoan Islands, was something that we had to deal with quite recently, when I got all my... So I've got the traditional Samoan tattoos. I got that done 3 years ago. I'm the first woman in 3 generations to have that done traditionally as well. Massive process. And we butted heads over that and it was something that I don't even think he expected, because when the islands were colonized by the Western missionaries, tattooing in the traditional process of tattooing was outlawed completely. And for women in particular, the practice was pretty much killed off for many generations, because it was a sign of the devil. You were a sinner if you had tattoos, more or less showed them off. So that huge part of our culture was erased by Western thinking. And so for him being brought up, at least on his mother's side, with that religious indoctrination, that really came out when I said to him, you know, I think I'm ready. And he was, why would you do that? You don't know how much it's going to hurt. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm not putting it on you. It's a responsibility I'm taking on myself, because I feel like, you know, not having grown up in Samoa, not having been around my family, I needed to do it at this time. And that's a good thing. You know, I'm not getting it for a fashion statement. I'm getting it as part of my own identity. And it took a long time to get past that. And it took him actually having been included in the physical process of getting it done, where he kind of had to deconstruct a lot of his own shit, essentially, to get through it. So there definitely is that generational trauma with our background as well. And what I found interesting, just having been on this panel, is the common threads of that too. Like, we all go through it, but it's interesting how it manifests in different ways, for sure.
Yeah, I'm the same. My father's a child of war, and I've never experienced war, and he cannot talk about his upbringing. And
Whoa, sorry. I think that was me.
And I think because even though I have a trauma, it's not the exact trauma that he has had, and in a sense, it's diluted in the realness. I still feel the pain because I know that's happened to him, but I haven't experienced it and understand it to the depths that he does. And so I find it interesting, as a daughter of a child of war who came from a monocultural society that probably wouldn't actually accept me. And also at the time that I was born, the perception or the idea of me was illegal in the countries that surrounded my dad's country. To come from that and be a really loudmouth person who is trying to make sure that stories happen and that people hear them, I think is my reaction to that, knowing that there is trauma there, but also knowing that I'm far enough away from it to work towards happiness, or work towards, or see that there is a light where I feel like the generations before me were either too traumatized to even look up, or were so traumatized that they didn't want to feel or talk about anything anymore. I know it's my place to start talking. if I can end this on a very short quote, because I think we're done. There's an amazing quote that I saw on a TED Talk, and sorry that I don't know the exact person who said it. But basically they said, you cannot make change if you cannot talk about it. And I think it's a really strong thread that all of us feel by way of music, songwriting, writing in general, or even just turning up to sit on a stage and have a conversation like this. I think it's really important in order to enact change. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming and being here, and also these amazing panellists for making us look so good. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks.